Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to a brand new unit. Welcome to the post-World War II world. We are starting the Cold War unit. The title of this lecture is called New World Order. Because essentially the world is going to be very different from the times before versus after World War II. In case you're wondering, this covers portions of 14.8 and 15.1 in our textbook, mostly 15.1. Here's your key terms list. We cover most all of these in this little lecture, or at least touch on them. But let's roll right into it. So, with the end of World War II, the colonies of Africa and Asia are going to start forming their own nations. South America is going to see waves of revolution. And the old world that was dictated by the British and French imperialism and other European nations will start to fade away with the conclusion of World War II. The wretched Second World War would bring Europe to its knees and weaken its long, influential arm of military and financial dominance on the globe. And as the dust settles, there's going to be two nations that really remain standing that have become superpowers. And in the expansion of their industrial, financial, and military capacities, the United States and the USSR would compete for dominance of the human race in how the world would be run in the remaining 20th century. We call this the Cold War because it lacked direct open conflict like World War I or World War II between the two great powers. Instead, the US and the USSR are going to have a fierce competition of everything else other than direct conflict in things of culture, military buildup, an arms race, a space race. There'll be proxy wars, espionage, all kinds of things, the Olympics, etc., etc. That is the nature of the Cold War. But essentially, what happens is the United States and the Soviet Union have radically different world views. America believed in the ideals of democracy, the application of capitalism, and a belief in general freedoms. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, drew their worldview from Karl Marx and the ideals of communism, a world of equality among laborers, security, free from religion, and united people, under a state for now, but hopefully one day a global people, workers united. These two worldviews, the American one and the Soviet one, felt they could not coexist, or they could not permanently coexist. One must dominate the other, is what both sides felt. Communism needed to liberate the world from the evils of capitalism, and America saw democracy as innate to humanity and the final crowning achievement of the human race. And so both sides saw themselves as opponents, direct in competition as things go down. Now we're going to break down these ideas into separate ideologies in different activities, but for now we're going to note that the Soviets and the Americans see each other as rivals on a giant chessboard. Essentially what happens is, do recall that the USSR and the United States were allies in World War II, but after World War II these nations parted ways. Really, the only thing that united the Soviets, the Americans, and the British is that they all hated the Nazis. That was their uniting force. And now that the Nazis were out of the picture, most people assumed that the next conflict would be between America and USSR for dominance of the globe. But let's break down what each of these countries are, setting the stage for World War III, starting with the USSR. Now, to prepare for World War III, because that's what we're thinking of, we know there isn't a World War III at this time, but people in this time period operated under the assumption of, oh, there's going to be another World War. It's probably going to be the Cold War blowing up, literally in our faces. So, anyways, to prepare for World War III, the Soviets moved into troops and influenced elections in various parts of Eastern Europe, and Central Europe as well. Nations like Poland and Hungary would serve as fortresses against the British, the French, and American advances into the Russian sphere of influence. These nations in Eastern Europe are what we would call satellite nations. Bigger nations like the Soviet Russia would dictate how these countries were run. And so in the satellite nation controlled by the Soviet Union, the Russian Soviets would influence how that culture's operated, their economy, their society, and politics. That is what a satellite nation does, is they are under the influence. Now, these satellite nations are going to provide the USSR with vital resources and manpower. Let's see here. Let's scroll down and get a bigger map of it. Essentially, what these satellite nations do is they bring in some resources. After Russia, Ukraine has the largest land army in Europe. Heavy industries from Czechoslovakia are tools for the Soviets as well. The industries of East Germany are a tool. Poland has people and equipment to contribute to the communist cause. All public property, since it's controlled by the government, since all people are assigned jobs in accordance to central planning, the Soviet was able to organize this region of the world, the Red, into a powerful bloc, the Soviet bloc. Anyone who questioned the Soviets within the Soviet bloc were disappeared, often re-educated if they were allowed to live. Because in the red portion of the world on this map, the communism was the answer. There were no alternatives to the Soviet world. This is the USSR and her satellites. Moving on to the other power, we have the United States of America, USA. The U.S. is, well, setting up for another World War II. They're capitalist and democratic. You'll learn more about that in a little bit. And have various activities. But President Truman concluded after the Potsdam Conference of 1945, this is one of the last meetings of the Allies during World War II. Truman came out of that meeting assuming that the Russians sought to take over the world in the name of communism. And so a couple of concepts are going to guide him in developing what is called the Truman Doctrine. This is the America bit. The gray is what we would call not America. But the documents that will guide the United States, or speeches or documents, are going to be a couple of things. There's going to be the Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill at a college in Missouri. And essentially he looked at the split between the Soviet-controlled satellite states and those of Western Europe, places like Belgium, France, the UK, West Germany. And he concluded that it's almost as if an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And Winston Churchill called upon the British and the Americans to take a stand against communism and contain it and prevent it from growing out into Asia and Western Europe. Because that was the concern. Is communism, the goal of communism is global revolution. And the Winston Churchill and the many Americans were not interested in a global revolution. It threatened their democratic and capitalist preferences. The other document, here's a good political cartoon of it. The other document that will influence American foreign policy, a big document, is in 1947 in the magazine called Foreign Affairs. An author who went by the name of X wrote that the Soviet Union would seek to expand communism throughout the world and would seek to dismantle democracy in the process of doing so. X advocated that communism needed to be contained by limiting its existence to the nations that already had communism in 1947. Essentially, this was kind of a combination of containment theory, which is what I just described, and domino theory. Domino theory is this idea that if you allow one nation to fall to communism, other nations will fall. So if Vietnam falls, Cambodia is next to go to communism, then Korea, then Japan, and then if not contained, like a set of dominoes being knocked over, what happens is in the end you realize communism is knocking on your door and there's no one left in the world to help you. That's the idea behind containment. That's the idea behind domino theory. Now, the author of this fun little document was this fellow here. Let's see here, George Kennan. He was considered a leading authority on the Soviet Union and its foreign policy. He was a diplomat. But he had a theory of how to contain these, the Soviets. According to Kennan, the USSR would only expand through easy opportunity. The USSR could not risk direct conflict with the United States of America. However, in order to prevent the spread of communism, it would take a long commitment of American economic, political, and social and military efforts to contain communism. He wasn't talking about ending communism at this point. So other people were talking about that. That'll be discussed in a different lecture. But the containment is the big concern with the Truman Doctrine that is ultimately founded. And the Truman Doctrine is the application of the concerns expressed by Winston Churchill and George Kennan. Basically, the United States would extend support to any nation that opposed communism. Examples of support are things like financial support, training of military experts support. Two big examples that occur immediately is in 1947, Congress approved $400 million to help stop communism revolts in Greece and Turkey. Another good example of Truman Doctrine in application is going to be the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was put in place to stop Western Europe from falling to communism. Basically, the Secretary of State, he was a former military commander during World War II, George C. Marshall, he pitched a plan in a speech at Harvard University that argued that Europe would fall to communism in desperation if nothing was done to help rebuild the economies and nations after World War II. And starting in 1948 and for the next 4 years, Americans would pour 13 billion U.S. tax dollars in grants and loans to Western European nations, as detailed in this map here. Essentially, the offer was offered to all nations, but satellite nations under the USSR were forbidden from taking funds, as ordered by Stalin. Stalin knew that the Marshall Plan was an attempt to ensure that these countries would look favorably upon the United States and resist communism. And so accepting Marshall Recovery Plan dollars was a direct threat to the Soviet Union. But as a result, American money flowed through Western Europe, and America's argument is that economic prosperity and investments were effective weapons against communism and a way of influencing American beliefs beyond her borders. And so this is one of those soft persuasion techniques to kind of dissuade communism from spreading. Containment in the economic sense, using capitalism to fight communism. Here's some pictures. That's what the logo looks like in German. West Germany was included in the plan. But let's talk about aggression. Essentially, World War III looked like it was, in the 40s and 50s, looked like it was going to begin in what was formerly known as Germany. I call it formerly because this was the occupation zone. And World War III was not going to start because of the Germans, mind you. It just so happens that all the troops were in the right place, and Germany would suffice as a good battlefield in this area. Basically, Germany after World War II was divided up into 4 occupation zones. The British had a bit, the Americans had a bit, the French managed to get a bit as well, because they won World War II too. The resistance did. The Vichy lost. And as well as, let's see here, the Soviets had this sector over here. Additionally, Berlin was divided up in this same manner. And the idea was troops would overwatch in these different sectors and make sure that the Nazis weren't rising again. Let's see, here's, I believe, this is a bit of a grainy map, but this is the breakup of Berlin as well. But one thing I will mention, in case you're curious, our sister city for Rapid City, Apolda, is located in the former Soviet sector, which would eventually become East Germany. So, kind of an interesting little factoid. So the British were overseeing the northwestern sections, which included the industrial cities like Dusseldorf, and there's Hamburg's up in this area. The Soviets oversaw the part by Poland and north of Czechoslovakia. America had the south, which included the Disneyland castle, Neuschwanstein, and the fun state of Bavaria and Munich, city of Munich. And the French, of course, had this area over here. But no, so... Now, the Soviets were really starting to feel the crunch of America's soft policies. Essentially the economics. Because essentially the U.S.'s solution is throw money at it, and that'll convince people to like you. And it's quite actually effective when you get right down to it. And so what was happening is people were fleeing from East Berlin and East Germany in droves for the West. And the Soviets needed to stop this. Also, the Soviets wanted all of Germany as part of their satellite state. They wanted more than East Germany. And to do that, they wanted to push the other occupation forces out of Berlin. And they did this through the Berlin blockade. Basically, the idea is cut Berlin off from the outside world and let it starve until the Soviets are given the whole city. Fortunately, there is one problem with that plan, for everyone living in Berlin, that is, and that is there's an airport in the center of Berlin, right here. And the beauty of this airport is essentially the United States heavily did a lot of the shipping, but it was coordinated through the British and the French as well. They used a lot of British and especially French airports. But for days on days, many American aircraft landed all the supplies you needed to sustain the city through the Soviet shutdown. And eventually the Soviets had to back off, and the British, Americans, and the French held on to their occupation zones. For many Americans, the Berlin Airlift is how it's remembered, and it showed the world and it showed Americans that the U.S. is committed to containing the Soviet Union. Here's a map of how kind of the flight's operations worked during the blockade. There's some pictures of it. They had a lot of military surplus aircraft after that war. This is particularly a time period where Germans came to associate Americans with chocolate, because that was one of the things that was airlifted. For the next portion, we're looking at the pacts and alliances that are put together for the World War III scenario. After the Berlin blockade and following Berlin airlift, America and her allies, particularly Britain, realized that they needed a better coordination so as to better counter and contain the Soviet threat. As such, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the countries in blue, was assembled to better coordinate this. It incorporated European countries like France, Italy, new allies like countries of Turkey and Greece who had fended off communist revolutionaries with the help of American funds. Canada, the United States, and eventually even West Germany was incorporated into this operation. This map is actually an old map. This map is a more updated map. NATO has come to absorb much of the former Soviet bloc as of recent. These nations, the British, the American, the French occupation zones, they merged also their occupation zones in Germany and formed what is called West Germany. And basically, this is the breakup of Europe. The blue is NATO, and the red is the counterpoint, the Warsaw Pact. And essentially, the idea behind NATO and ultimately the Warsaw Pact is collective defense. If you attacked one NATO country, you attacked them all. That's what the Article 5 clause is. Any nation that attacks a NATO nation, it's like you've declared war on all NATO nations. It was a deterrent. Additional factors that come out of this, NATO will increasingly standardize communication standards, ammunition types, things like that. So, military people are probably a bit more up on the exact nature of this, but there's like a standardized 9mm, a standardized 5.56mm round. Different standardizations like that, radio communications, things like that. Now, if you feel like NATO is posed to swallow up the Soviet Union, that's exactly what the Warsaw nations felt. The Soviets felt. To counteract this problem, the Soviets formed what is called the Warsaw Pact. It's basically included all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, all those satellite nations, except for Yugoslavia, which kind of broke off and formed its own communist, non-aligned power. But essentially, the Warsaw Pact operated on the exact same idea of, if you attack one of us, you've just attacked all of us. So that's kind of the setup there. Because there's a great deal of concern that if given the chance, the NATO troops would pour over from West Germany into East, or vice versa, etc., etc. And so that was the idea behind this. To just wrap things up, World War II may have ended in an American and Allied Russian victory together, but they realized that they didn't really have a lot in common other than mutual hatred of the Nazis. And so it was widely expected in this new world order between the competing superpowers of America and the Soviet Union that World War III would be fought between these two nations, and the winner, if there was anything left, would ideologically rule over the rest of the world into the remainder of whatever was left of the 20th century and beyond. But that's a topic for a future unit. Until later.